Good morning, everyone. Today is Wednesday, August 5th, 2020, the third day of our retreat in place. We're studying the Four Noble Truths, and today we're talking about the second noble truth, often called the cause of suffering. And we're looking forward to being able to bring that to you and discuss that. But before we do that, I'd like to, a couple of sutras that we would like to read. I did find, and I will be able to get it up on my screen share today, the Sutra on Happiness. And I'm wondering, and since there's 30 people on right now, I can only see 25 of you. So if you want to raise your hand, you may have to use the raise your hand icon, which is if you toggle over participants, you can find. But I would like 2 volunteers to read the Sutra on Happiness. Are there anybody available here today? Bonnie?
Yes.
Thank you. And could I have another reader, perhaps? Dottie, thank you. So if you could just basically alternate paragraphs, and we'll see how this goes here. So you just alternate paragraphs. Bonnie, you might want to read all the way down to the first paragraph there, and you can begin whenever you like.
This is the Buddha's answer. Okay. Discourse on Happiness. I heard these words of the Buddha one time when the Lord was living in the vicinity of Savarthi at the Anathapindika monastery in the Jeta Grove. Late at night, a deva appeared whose light and beauty made the whole Jeta Grove shine radiantly. After paying respects to the Buddha, the deva asked him a question in the form of a verse. Many gods and men are eager to know what are the greatest blessings which bring about a peaceful and happy life. Please, Tathagata, will you teach us?
This is the Buddha's answer. Not to be associated with the foolish ones, to live in the company of wise people, honoring those who are worth honoring. This is the greatest happiness.
To live in a good environment, to have planted good seeds, and to realize that you are on the right path. This is the greatest happiness.
To have a chance to learn and grow, to be skillful in your profession or craft, practicing the precepts and loving speech. This is the greatest happiness.
To be able to serve and support your parents, to cherish your own family, to have a vocation that brings you joy. This is the greatest happiness.
To live honestly, generous in giving, to offer support to relatives and friends, living a life of blameless conduct. This is the greatest happiness.
To avoid unwholesome actions, not caught by alcoholism or drugs, and to be diligent in doing good things. This is the greatest happiness.
To be humble and polite and in manner, to be grateful and content with the simple life, and not missing the occasion to learn the Dharma. This is the greatest happiness.
To persevere and be open to change, to have regular contact with monks and nuns, and to fully participate in Dharma discussions. This is the greatest happiness.
To live diligently and attentively, to perceive the noble truth, and to realize nirvana. This is the greatest happiness.
to live in the world with your heart undisturbed by the world, with all sorrows ended, dwelling in peace. This is the greatest happiness.
For he or she who accomplishes this, unvanquished wherever she goes, always he is happy and safe. Happiness lives within oneself.
Thank you, dear friends. And I have another short sutra that I would like us to read, and I'm wondering if we could have 2 volunteers for that. That's called the Kalama's Dilemma, and it's about teachers. Are there any volunteers for that? Bill, thank you. And a second person, perhaps? Jay, thank you very much. Go back up here to my share screen. So perhaps you could also alternate paragraphs here and kind of go with that. So start whenever you like.
The Kalama's Dilemma. One time, Buddha was walking on a tour with a large group of monks when he came to a town of the Kalamas called Kesaputta. The Kalamas thought, "It is very good indeed to see awakened ones such as these." And so they went up to where the Buddha was. Having seated themselves to one side, the Kalamas said this to the Buddhas.
There are, sir, many different teachers that have come here. They illustrate and illuminate their own doctrines, but the doctrines of others they put down, revile, disparage, and cripple. For us, sir, uncertainty arises, and doubts arise concerning them. Who indeed of these venerable teachers speaks truly? Who speaks falsely?
It is indeed fitting, Kalamas, to be uncertain. It is fitting to have doubt. For in situations of uncertainty, doubts surely arise. You should decide, Kalamas, not by what you have heard, not by following convention, not by assuming it is so, not by relying on the text, not because of reasoning, not because of logic, not by thinking about explanations, not by acquiescing to the views that you prefer, not because it appears likely, and certainly not out of respect for a teacher.
When you would know, Kalamas, for yourselves that these things are unhealthy, these things, when entered upon and undertaken, incline toward harm and suffering, then, Kalamas, you should reject them.
But when you would know, Kalamas, for yourselves that these things are healthy, these things, when entered upon and undertaken, incline toward welfare and happiness, then, Kalamas, having come to them, you should stay with them.
That person, Kalamas, who is a follower of the noble path, is thus free of wanting, free of harming, and without confusion. Clearly, conscious and mindful, he or she abides with a mind dedicated to loving kindness, compassion, goodwill, and equanimity that is abundant, expansive, immeasurable, kindly, and free of harming.
And so, Kalamas, the follower of the noble path, whose mind is thus kindly and free of harming, their mind is not defiled, but is purified. Hold it, I just ran out of text. Oh, sorry.
Thank you all for thanks for all of the readers for participating today. We are on the second of the Four Noble Truths. These things that I would like to almost call natural laws rather than some particular philosophy that people have brought on. These are things that are just able to be noted just by observation. Nothing real deep or esoteric about them. And yesterday we talked about the presence of suffering, what is called the truth of suffering, that suffering just happens because of who we are as human beings. And that they're talking about what we mostly call the first arrow and second arrow parts of it. And we'll talk about that, how in our lives things just come up that feel uneasy, and there's no way around that. And what we do with that is our opportunity to practice. So I want to mention something about Buddhism in general, and I feel that it has a bad rap, so to speak. Whenever you hear things about Buddhism, especially casually, it has a rather dour kind of reputation. My particular experience with Buddhism, especially in the Plum Village tradition with our wonderful teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, has been one of joy and expansiveness and love and connection to everything. I have seldom had a situation in my life that has caused more individual joy for me, and not just for me, for people around who are practicing. And yet, when you talk to people about the ideas relating to Buddhism, you often have this idea that it's very depressive and very pessimistic. For example, and we had that wonderful chant yesterday by Dick about the 5 remembrances. Well, the 5 remembrances, which are often quoted, are I am of the nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. I am of the nature to have ill health. There's no way to escape having ill health. I am of the nature to die. There is no way to escape death. There is no way to escape being separated from everyone and everything I love. And the 5th one is about Dharma, which is about karma, rather, which is my actions are my only true possession. These are extremely important and there are, especially in the Theravadan tradition, there are monks that chant these several times a day. Not surprisingly, Theravadan monks are not invited to a lot of parties, and there are a lot of kind of heaviness associated with this. This is why I want to bring forth, because I have this feeling that when I mention what the common idea of the Second Noble Truth is, it hits you heavy, and it's like, well, that's kind of a depressing thing. So I want to be able to expand on it. The common thing that we hear about the Second Noble Truth is the cause of suffering is desire. And that just like, wow. I mean, for a lot of people, it's like, well, I kind of like my desires, and I have a lot of really good desires. I have a desire for, say, social justice. I have a desire to love my children and my community. I have a desire to eat healthy. I have a desire to study the Dharma. I mean, all of these things are desires. And that kind of an idea that desire is inherently bad, I think, turns people off. And it is, again, one of those things that needs further explanation. Once again, we fall into the trap of words. Words, as they were trying to be given to the to people way back when, and then translated and retranslated. I mean, for example, most of the sutras were written in Pali or Sanskrit, and the Buddha didn't speak Pali or Sanskrit. He spoke something called Magadhan, which was local dialect. And so everything, as anybody who has played telephone in kindergarten knows that there's lots of ways that these things can go wrong. And tomorrow I want to talk about this a little bit more, but the idea that the Buddhists are just talking about all of these really incredibly difficult things, pain and suffering, is just not true. However, it is. First noble truth is the truth of suffering, and the second noble truth is the cause of suffering, and this is the way it has been organized. So I like to think of, and again, there's lots of really, so yesterday I mentioned that there were a lot of problems with words. There are a couple of really, I like cool words that I run into in Buddhism that I kind of want to use. So the cause of suffering are actually what are called the three kleshas, Kleshas. And kleshas are these kind of, they're related to what we talked about yesterday. One of the kleshas is called tanha, also called thirst. And this is the one that also is translated so frequently as craving. This is attraction for something. This is something that you have a great deal of, you want this thing, you want this condition, you want this particular connection. And it also is very interesting when you read the sutras, besides craving for things in the world, it also includes craving for existence and craving for non-existence. So either of those kinds of things go on with that. And that's the first klesha, often translated as craving or desire. The second one is usually about aversion, which often comes up as things like hatred or anger or hostility. And this is also, again, just something that kind of happens. You don't often hear the second noble truth that the cause of that is anger and hostility. People tend to throw that all into the same thing about craving, but quite frankly, they're a little bit different. And the third klesha is called ignorance, or perhaps sometimes confusion. But ignorance is feeling very neutral or very kind of unattached. When we talk about ignorance, we talk not necessarily about the idea of not having knowledge, which is what you commonly get in the English language. Ignorance is more about the root word ignore, not seeking the truth, not being open to the truth, sort of a dullness associated with it. And these are the main causes of the second arrows: craving or attachment, aversion or hatred and hostility, and ignorance or neutrality, boredom, things along those lines. And of course, often you see kleshas upon kleshas. You see things that happen more and more. So the reactions you get to those initial responses to those first arrows are often things like anticipation and wishful thinking and anxiety and doubt and affirmation and a lot of things that go on with that sort of thing. And these all happen pretty quickly too. And these are things that we sort of desire to work with. And I even say that when I talk about these things, I love the phrase that Stephen Batchelor he puts in his book about these things. We talk about these things being like our aversion and our craving, but they're not even ours. They're just part of a natural law. Just as a mosquito bites you on the arm and you get an itch, that's a natural law. When things arise to cause craving, that's a natural law. It's not that they've made a mistake. It's not that anything is wrong. However, what you do with that afterwards is often the most important thing. The idea of also, however, of this reactivity is it can be very cyclical. And it is when the Buddha actually talks about how these kleshas build on each other and build on each other. You know, you have more thoughts about this and more thoughts about that and more aggression towards, at least in your mind, towards this particular person or group of people, et cetera, et cetera. He talks of those as being fires, that they're fires. And there's actually wonderful sermon coming shortly after the sermon he gave that we had the other day on the turning of the wheel, called the fire sermon, where he actually was talking to people who are fire worshipers, but talking about all of these kleshas necessarily being fires. And one of my favorite ones that happens today, people may recognize this sort of in their own lives, is the idea of endless webs of thought. Things getting more and more complex, more and more complex. Thinking about it and having, more rationalizations about things, more explanations, more degrees of righteousness, et cetera, et cetera. And my favorite Buddhist word, perhaps, is the phrase for when that happens. It's called papanaka. So we all recognize, I think, papanaka. How does that happen? Exactly what's going on? How do we do that? When we start to get into the situation and we realize what is going on, how we are building upon this initial reactivity. We are making little homes and houses out of our beliefs, out of our desires and cravings, or quite frankly, our hatred and hostility. We fall under the kind of spell of this desire to defend this organic being, this ego. And in a larger sense, and I will certainly talk about this later this week, the more important thing is we are trying to save either our own little organic self or those people who are in our tribe. This is what we do. These are what all these things are about. And it's not only that they are damaging to us on an individual basis, but they are also damaging to us on a larger basis. That we really know nowadays that if everybody tries to defend their tribe, that nothing gets done. That there's no way for society to progress. I love in the scriptures, in the sutras, how the Buddha will come and say he'll be doing something, and Mara, who is, of course, in the sutras an actual being, but it's probably just a reflection of our own minds. Mara will come and kind of tempt the Buddha to do this or to do that. And of course, we all, or maybe a lot of us know the night of his enlightenment, all of the things that Mara apparently threw to him. And the Buddha makes Mara disappear by saying, "I know you, Mara." So knowing these things is how we basically go about getting rid of them. The second slogan, the second of the fourfold task that Stephen Batchelor talks about, is just the rising is to be let go of. We should see it as something that there it is, but we can allow it to be let go. And so this is the practice. This is what we do. This is how we notice that. So we notice that these three kleshas are coming for us. There they are: attraction, aversion, and ignorance. And that if we work skillfully, we can learn how to take care of that. So what do we mean by skillful means? So I'm going to share my whiteboard here. And I've been on retreat with our wonderful root teacher, Thich Nhat Hanh, I think about 14 times. I think I counted it up once, starting in 1993, and last time was 2007. And he does a lot of different things, but he always talks about this model, about how we can kind of deal with our afflictive emotions and our difficulties. For people who want a kind of larger umbrella to throw this under, it's called the Abhidharma, or the true Dharma. And this is a model that he frequently uses. And I know that people have seen this before. I don't want to go into a lot of detail because there are other things I really want to cover here as well. But the idea is that we have, what is called our store consciousness, which he makes equivalent to a basement. We have seeds. Originally, when he first taught this, when I first learned this back in the 90s, he talked about 51 types of seeds. About the 2000s, he had added 13 more, so there are 64 types of seeds, depending on various schools about that. And the seeds, the kleshas are very much involved with seeds here. The seed of craving, the seed of anger, hatred, hostility, and certainly the seed of ignorance are all on there. But there's lots of other seeds, and there's both what are called wholesome seeds and unwholesome seeds. And he likens this to sort of these things that are living in your basement. You're never aware of them. And your mind consciousness is something that happens that you are aware of. This is your living room. This is where you note things. This is where kind of everything sort of happens. So you may have, say, a seed of fear. And then when the seed of fear, and it's lying in your stored consciousness. So when the seed of fear comes up, you really don't have any choice. I think one of the more interesting things that happened that we know that actually the Buddhists talk about quite a bit when they start talking about some of these mental states is that when the seed of anger has been watered and it comes up, you have no choice but to be angry. And in fact, according to modern neuroscience, there's about a quarter of a second where your amygdala has fired, and you know that all of the cascade, both from the standpoint of what's going on in your mind, in your body, relating to anger, is on its way to happening, and you're completely unaware of it. So anyway, let's talk about anger. But everybody likes anger because everybody can understand it. So what happens with, I gotta make sure I have the right thing here. Let's say this is a seed of anger, and someone has watered it. In what way? And they have said something, they have done something, and of course we get into our egos about this. And like a plant of some sort, it sprouts into our mind consciousness. So now we have all the manifestations, both physical and thought related, about anger. There it is. It's right there in our living room, and there it's going. And it will stay a while and then go away, eventually either burning itself out or persisting at a low level. As you know, some people have anger happening very frequently. Some people have anger that never really seems to go away, but usually it does. And in those kinds of situations, it goes back to the store consciousness, and usually a little bit stronger. However, when anger is watered, as you also know, other kinds of seeds, these second arrow seeds start coming up too. The seed of righteousness, the seed of indignation, the seed of self, of ego. All of these things happen. The really skillful means that Thich Nhat Hanh talks about so frequently is to do this. Whenever a seed, let's talk about anger, it could be anything else, but let's talk about anger, comes up, that we immediately can water a different seed, the seed of mindfulness. And mindfulness is also a seed in our consciousness. When this happens in the traditional Abhidharma model, the seeds embrace each other. And as you bring mindfulness to your anger, two things happen. The first is your anger resolves a little bit quicker. The second part is that your seed of anger becomes a little bit weaker, a little bit harder to get there. So, as a second arrow practice, you notice that it is. And what do we mean by bringing mindfulness? What do we mean by watering a seed of mindfulness in this particular model? What we mean is paying attention to what's actually happening with us, not with our enemy, not like the person who made us angry, not the situation that made us angry, but what's actually happening in our physical bodies and a little bit in our mind, but mostly in our physical body. Where do things seem tense for you? You have a tenseness in your jaw. You have a tightness in your chest. Is your stomach doing the flip-flops? Any of those are perfectly fine, and you notice them without necessarily trying to change them or make a judgment. And you can kind of go and take care of that. And this allows you to not shoot that second arrow, to be able to see your anger almost like you would see a crying baby that you kind of embrace until you can calm it down. The interesting thing, however, also for this is it's a first arrow practice as well, because as your seed returns to its natural state, you will actually have it being a little bit weaker. And the next time events happen that cause you to be angry, that might otherwise have shown up as anger, they'll be harder to manifest. So on the short term, the idea that we often talk about is resiliency, being able to deal with our anger. Mindfulness is there to do that. In the long term, where you actually can say, how do I take care of all of these things as they occur? It works that way as well. So a good overall practice. Bringing mindfulness to anything in that particular way is the way that things go. I also want to make it feel that it's really important to know that there are really, it's a good model for gardeners, because we talk about seeds, and there, Vietnam, but not just Vietnam, the Abhidharma actually came from India. But it was very well received in places like Vietnam and China, because everybody grew stuff, everybody understood plants. That the idea also, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in the next couple of days, about watering positive seeds and wholesome seeds. So I always like to say mindfulness can't go wrong for you. It can help take care of your afflictions. It can help you keep your afflictions at bay a little bit the next time things come around. And it also, as you spend some time watering positive and wholesome seeds, it allows your garden, instead of just having a lot of weeds and snaggly looking things that are ugly and giving you difficulty, you can grow flowers and trees and plants that give you wonderful tomatoes or fruit. A terrific way to kind of go with that. So it's interesting though, I mean, because I want to just mention also that one of the things that Thich Nhat Hanh talks about is that it's not all suffering. He actually has a whole, I may have not mentioned that, he has a whole chapter in his book, The Heart of the Buddhist Teachings, called, Is Everything Suffering? And he has this kind of way of being that is really very, very interesting. That, he mentions these same sort of problems that I have seen with Buddhism. That idea that, my goodness, everything's, what? Yes, is really terrible. Everything's suffering. Everything is not suffering. However, dealing with the suffering allows us to deal with the joy of life. So in this book, Good Citizens, which a lot of these talks have been taken from, Thich Nhat Hanh has this wonderful list by the way, the Buddhism is among religions the USA Today of religions. They've got lists for everything. And a lot of that is because, of course, it was a pre-verbal society and it was easier to do this. But I wanted to mention these things. It's one of these little lists, and actually when I started going into Mr. Google and looking at various sources, that everybody seems to have a different list of these things called fetters or knots, or I love the regular Sanskrit word better, samyojana. Everybody talks about these 10 samyojanas. So I want to just kind of dismiss the first three pretty quickly, which is that, and these are all seen as possible causes of suffering in individual people. And the first three that he mentions are craving, anger, and ignorance. And we kind of really already talked about that. And the idea, of course, with, again, once again to mention it, craving is not just craving for things in our environment. It's also the craving for existence, and interestingly, the craving for non-existence. The fourth samyojana, the fourth fetter, are called complexes, which is interesting. I think he's using modern terms here because most of the old lists that I looked up didn't have anything that was called complexes. But it is such an interesting thing that he has taken on over the years. He had a really deadpan sense of humor. I remember one of the retreats I went on in the 2000s sometime when he was developing a lot of this model. He started out his Dharma talk by saying, low self-esteem is a problem. High self-esteem is a problem. Self-esteem is a problem. So yes, Peggy asked me if I'm saying fetters, F-E-T-T-E-R-S. Yes, that's what I'm saying. Right? And it's interesting that now in the particular chants, when the monks give a chant, they actually have, an opening verse that talks about being free from the superiority complex, the inferiority complex, and the equality complex. He doesn't ever mention it, but I think it's really nice. It's this old 16th century, probably earlier than that, saying, which is that comparisons are odious. That how we do with comparisons is a difficulty. And if you think about it from the standpoint of going back to our hunter-gatherer things, it's all related to status. The fifth samyojana or fetter is doubt. I don't want to go into that too much today, but we can talk about that again. The sixth one is called This Body Is Me. And the idea is that you are just this body, and specifically that you're not really connected to the rest of the universe. The seventh samyojana is called Pairs of Opposites, which is this idea that dualistic thinking gets us into difficulty. We're certainly going to notice that tomorrow when we do our chant. We've got a wonderful chant that talks all about dualism called Affirming Faith in Mind, and we'll be doing that tomorrow morning. The eighth fetter is called Attachment to Views, and I'm going to talk quite a bit about that on the fourth day when we start talking about the Eightfold Path. And the other one is what is actually called a perverted view, but I think that it is one of those things that it's actually the attachment, it's actually the ignorance that things have cause and effects. So people often think that things just spontaneously arise, when in reality everything has cause and effects. And that kind of idea is one of those things that goes on. That's that. And then the 10th samyojana, which I really like, and I kind of is curious about, is attachments to rites and rituals. It's really interesting that how the Buddha himself, getting back to the way he was being just a wandering teacher in dusty India or or muddy India, depending on whether it was the rainy season or not, had these very simple practices. He didn't do much at all. He was actually trying very hard to keep people from deifying him, from looking at this as more than anything else. And they probably had a few little ideas and rituals. And we know that simply because there is a rule of the monastics written down called the Vinaya. So some of those are kind of rituals. And we have certain rituals. We bow in, we bow out. We actually have situations where we do the morning chant. It's kind of a ritual. Those sorts of things. But we try to keep it at a minimum because what we really like to do is take this open so that people don't have, as it was in the sutra, you should not accept anything, even out of respect for a teacher, unless it seems true to you. And I think that one of the things that the Buddha was trying to do was demystify these kinds of things, not let them seem like there was only a special group of people that could do this. My belief, and this comes from not just what I have to say, but from scholars like Lynn Wallace and Stephen Batchelor, is that enlightenment, quote unquote, is common. It's extraordinarily common. It happens to almost all of us. We don't get to stay there all the time. But if you've ever had an episode where you made a different decision than your reactivity, then you have done something that's an enlightened act. This is what I think the Buddha was talking about and those sorts of things. So on my share screen, just to go over this one. So these are the samyojanas that Thich Nhat Hanh talks about: craving, anger, ignorance, complexes, doubt. This body is me, pairs of opposite. Attachment to views and ignorance of interdependence, attachment to rights and rituals. So just to give people kind of an idea about a lot of other sources that we have. We certainly have a lot of sources in our existence for second arrows. And we actually live in a world where we have a great deal of knowledge, a great deal of intellectual knowledge, and certainly in the space of things that you see, two areas where there is a great deal of first arrow stuff, a great deal of reactivity, is the news media and politics. And they're all over the place now. And we see them especially, related to this pandemic. How much of the things that we see or we hear about that are relating to the pandemic are desired or seem to be designed to hit our reactivity. So that's one of those things that we can kind of be aware of. Step back, water your seed of mindfulness, have an idea about being able to observe deeply your body's sensations and that sort of thing, and continue to practice. So I could go on a little more, but I think I'd like to just open now to any kind of questions. You can try to bow, but I may not necessarily see you. So like I say, if you toggle your mouse or whatever you have under participants, there's a raise hand function. That might be the best way to go. And Colleen's very aware of raising the hand. She's done this before. So Colleen, you have a question. Thank you.
Good morning. Yes, I do. Could you say a little bit more about the craving for non-existence?
Yeah. So it's interesting. When the Buddha started talking about this kind of, and tomorrow I want to go into why this was set up a little bit. These talks kind of inter-are. Sometimes you ask a question that I'll get to tomorrow, but it is this idea that people decided that they liked the idea of no self so much that they became that became almost their religion, their way of being. And while there is a truth of no self, the Buddha always thought to be caught in that was worse than being caught in self. He said, well, if people are caught in self, then I can do something about that. But when they're caught in no self, it doesn't look like there's much we can do about that. And that people actually did have a craving for non-being. They just decided not to do anything, not to take. And that often led to things like not taking responsibility either. And so the craving for non-being falls right out of the idea that attachment to any kind of view is a particular problem and a source of suffering. The attachment to craving for existence, the one that we all kind of know and really get to, which is like, well, we have a craving for existence. That's why we're wearing masks, right? We're wearing masks because we have craving for existence. And we have craving not only for our own existence, but for other people's existence. The idea that attachment to any view is a problem, including the attachment to non-self. So many people back then really often would get to the idea that their practice should be a craving for non-existence. So I hope that was useful, Colleen. Thanks. Someone else had their hand up. Peggy?
Hi. Would you please put the Fetter handout up, or maybe just send it to us in an attachment?
Oh, sure.
Because
Yeah.
it'll help me remember it better. Thank you.
Yeah. And I will say this, like I say, so it was really, I've always loved the term that Thai has used called samyajana. I always thought that was a really good word. Maybe my second after papanaka.
Well, we got to know how to spell it.
Great word. Just how our minds just chatter and chatter. Papanaka. But samyajana, and it's very interesting when you start looking up into the Wikipedia type stuff, and you find that I found 5 different lists of samyajana, and they were all 10 of them, and everybody had 10 different ones, including Thai. But it really made me understand a lot about what Thai was talking. For example, Thai really does have this big thing, and it's one of those things that became, when I first started working with Thai in the 90s, he didn't talk about it at all. But in the 2000s, he started talking a lot about complex, inferior superiority, and the equality complex, which you think, well, that's interesting. How does that fit in? We could talk about that some other time, but it's very, very interesting how that is. Yes, but I will send that out. Are you on the listserv, Peggy? Yeah, so I'll just send it out with the
Yes.
recording today this afternoon. So,
Thank you.
thanks. Back to where I was. Any other hands up? Jay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Paul. Another wonderful talk. And but I have to say that I'm not so sure you convinced me of the lack of austerity. That's probably too strong of a word, of the general concept of Buddhism. And maybe, again, it's probably just my, Western mind thinking of, because, right, the first noble truth is suffering, and that's what our attention is drawn to. And therefore, like in the whole discussion and focus on suffering, and not to say that, while the first noble truth is suffering, I understand that there are these solutions to that, or these remedies to that. And the Thich Nhat Hanh or the Dalai Lama, even yourself, right, are much more lighthearted than what that might otherwise deem. But I appreciate you talking about that. But again, I'm not so sure you convinced me of that lack of, and austerity is too strong of a word, but I do know what you mean, like this kind of, not doom and gloom even, but just this kind of paleness of a shadow over it, right? As opposed to the lighthearted, like, yeah, well, life is suffering, but there's a lot of other good stuff out there. And here's a way that we address it. And here's how we water the seeds of mindfulness and all of that. And so I'm not sure that there is an answer, but that's my comment and or question.
Thank you. Thank you, Jay, for your comment on that. We every once in a while, uh, run across people who come to the center for a couple of months, and I'm fine with this. They come to our center for a while, and then they say things like, you guys are just like too pie in the sky type people. I just can't handle this. I don't want to have anything. And I send them somewhere else. I said, well, sure, but there are other people practicing, So if you want to do, 10,000 frustrations, I know the place where you can do that. So, it all just depends on how that is. We are in a very interesting part in history of the emergence of Buddhism in the United States. And, one of our members made a very interesting comment to me that I still hold on to. Paul Brodwin, who is an anthropologist, has looked at this and said, our particular Western Buddhism may be actually more genuine because we're going back to the Pali Canon. We're going back to the kind of things that we reasonably expect the Buddha said. And it's very interesting. Many of the layers that happened in the centuries that happened afterwards sort of changed the idea of Buddhism into more of a ritualistic, religion-based type thing. So, thanks, Jay. Chris?
Hi, Paul.
Chris here?
Would you speak to jealousy and where jealousy seems to cut into a few of these different places, but can you speak more purely to it? And maybe
Jealousy.
how you think, and
Yeah.
jealousy, and
Yeah.
maybe
Yeah.
how, I think it differs from envy, but I would rather have your opinion on that.
Yeah, all of that is related to a craving, right? It's wanting things to be different than they are. It's wanting this particular thing. And the secondary part of that is related to, and we haven't talked much about this, related to our hunter-gatherer mind, which involves status. So people can't be, if they have more than I can't be happy. Well, you need to be happy. Oh, $1 million. But if I know I've got $1 million, somebody else has got $1,001,001, I'm unhappy. That kind of a thing. And so it all has to be related to the defense of the ego, that sort of thing. And again, that's kind of a little bit more related to status. So
Thank you.
thanks. Larry?
You bet.
Thank you, Paul, again, for discussion, particularly of the first arrows and the second arrows. The question I have about the first arrows is that I was thinking about, kind of getting ahead of myself, obviously, thinking about what can we do about first arrows. It seems like with first arrows, acceptance, recognition, awareness, and then acceptance is probably helpful. But I think often we look at things like illness and so forth with the second fetter of aversion, and we make it worse. Is your demonstrating the seeds, I thought was very helpful in that it's not only about accepting or not accepting, but bringing up these other seeds, these positive seeds of, say, mindfulness, as a way to maybe decrease the potency of the first arrow. I'm just wondering, is that for many people, this idea of acceptance is one of the most difficult things. In other words, to accept illness and aging and so forth. And it almost seems like, finally out of resignation, we say, well, it is what it is. Any other ideas on the first arrow, those 5 things that often causes suffering that, we don't have it's there. So thank you.
Yeah. So thank you, Larry. Do you want me to get a little neurogeeky or not?
If that makes you happy, Paul, sure.
Yeah. So very quickly, when an event happens in your life, there's a part of your brain that decides whether you like it or don't like it. And it happens so quickly and so automatically, it actually happens before you even know what it is. if you look at the sequence and how things fire in the brain. So this is one of those things, and that's a first error. That's a first error. And it's going to happen kind of all the time. Now, if the first arrow is an aversion thing, then it is difficult for us to turn around and face it. Or even if it's something that is an attraction thing, it's difficult for us to consider letting go of that. But that's the practice. That's the practice, is to kind of turn towards that as soon as you realize it. And that may actually be a really difficult part with that. Your little seed may have blossomed and sprouted in your living room and is now taking over your couch and your piano, and it's all over the place before you say, oh, maybe I should water my seed of mindfulness. Never a bad idea, but the earlier we catch it, the better off it is. But this is a natural tendency related to our hunter-gatherer ancestors on the planet. If it wasn't aversion, we stayed away from it. That's how we survived. In most kinds of situations where you can't stay away from it, you've got a crabby teenager. Well, what are you going to do about that? You can't run away from the crabby teenager. You're going to have to deal with that. You turn towards it. And this is a difficult thing to do. And, the idea that we turn towards our afflictions is a really hard thing for people to kind of work with. And I think it just takes a matter of experience. The people I know who have done this are so grateful that they've actually learned how to do this. But it actually is, and in one of the practices that I frequently talk about is actually learning to do this when you're not really feeling that particular aversion, so that when it comes, it doesn't kind of overwhelm you. But these kinds of things, and in one of the sutras that I read in the book that, in the Stephen Batchelor book, was about that, says, if these things weren't pleasant, if they didn't do something for us, they wouldn't be so hard to deal with. If aversion didn't have some immediate problem with it, for example, you got the crabby teenager, you don't want to deal with it, you go to another room, you go to a bar, you do something, you get away. Well, that automatically makes you feel better on the short term. In the long term, it doesn't. And, those kinds of things, if they didn't actually do something, they wouldn't be so hard to kind of deal with. Some of them were always bad, meaning even when caveman days, they probably wouldn't work. But most of them are just archaic. You're asking us to solve a modern problem with a sort of what Larry Ward calls the survival physiology. And it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work towards the kinds of things we need to do when we need to have cooperation, for example, and when we need to have a ability to kind of see bigger pictures. So, thanks, Larry. Mike?
Yes. I was thinking about your, when you gave the example of the seed of anger and, trying to counter that, if that's the right phrase, through the, watering mindfulness, watering the seed of consciousness. You emphasized to that awareness of mainly through physical sensations, becoming aware of physical sensations.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I probably rarely do that. And, it's certainly something I need to work on, but I'm also kind of curious maybe about the transition from paying attention to one's physical sensations, to, the sort of thoughts that arise, or or what may be some thoughts that are appropriate or helpful for dealing with a seed of anger or something, some other unwholesome seed.
Thanks, Mike. The Buddha, and not just the Buddha, said we pay attention to our body. He didn't use these words, he used other words, because you get more bang for the buck that way. Paying attention to anger, fear, anxiety, despair, all of these things that wrap under the category of wholesome seed, unwholesome seeds. You do better by paying attention to the body. But paying attention to what your thoughts are, especially if they're recurrent thoughts, is very useful. I was dealing once with people doing mindfulness in a homeless shelter, and I had this really interesting experience. This very, this person who I wouldn't have expected to be kind of bodhisattva speaking, but made this very interesting statement. She says, whenever I'm angry, she was a homeless person living at Hope House. She says, whenever I'm angry, my kids pop into my mind. Whether I'm angry at my caseworker or my partner or the police or myself or my situation, my kids pop in. Interesting. Her relationship with her children might be fractious, and it was realized that was something that she could kind of explore. So all emotions are thought sensation, are thoughts plus body sensation. But I always like to tell body sensations first. Thoughts are a little bit more difficult, and thoughts can definitely lead down the path to papanyaka, to continual discourse about the particular problem. I mean, let's face it, when you're really angry and you're upset, especially when you've got that real righteous anger, not real righteous anger, where that person's, I mean, how in the world could they do, what were they thinking? What were they thinking? They're idiots. When you can go down that path, you can really have, a real truckload of papanyaka in that kind of situation. And sometimes instead of going there and getting caught up in that, getting back to your body may be the best thing to do. So, let's see, someone else had their hand raised. Gary, good to see you, Gary.
Hi, Paul. Hi, Peggy. Paul, does Thich Nhat Hanh ever talk about the connection between fear and anger, or fear as maybe primary to a lot of these seeds?
Yes.
He does, okay.
In a short word, yes. I mean, he has a book about anger that basically is mostly about fear. And so, yeah, the seeds of anger and fear, I'm sure you know this, is all related to the idea of craving for existence. And
Right.
It's craving for defense, and it's defending the ego, that sort of thing. They're very, very similar to each other. And of course, there's a lot of correlation with that. So many people, for example, can't really, whatever, either by their constitution or the way they were raised, they can't get angry, but they can't get fearful. And they get fearful instead, or maybe even sad. So you see a lot of people who have a real correlation with these things, definitely. The interaction in that model that I had of the store consciousness, those seeds are all affecting each other. I mean, they're not individual separate seeds, they're all affecting each other. So,
Right.
Does that sound right?
Sounds good to me, Paul. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Gary. Anyone else have a question? I think maybe you're on the other screen, whoever you are. Oh, yes, Meredith, there you are. You were in the other screen. So. You need to unmute, Meredith. We're still not hearing you, Meredith.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can, yes, there we go.
I'm sorry. I was thinking about an example. There's a listing of different kinds of suffering. Suffering caused by change, suffering caused by external events, weather, hurricanes. And those things are things that are out of our control. But the third kind of suffering that always struck me as the real source of suffering is self-inflicted. That is, I may feel pain, discomfort, dissatisfaction with becoming older. And I may have a whole list of things that I find unpleasant about that. But it's not those things exactly that create the suffering in me. It's how I accept and deal with them. And if I fight with the things that are happening, I'm really shooting the second arrow into myself. But if I look at the other side of it, you know, the joys of, in this case, we'll stay with aging, the joys of aging, then I don't shoot the second arrow, or I stop it before it really hits me in the heart. And I find all those contrary things that come along with age and are not suffering, but rather bring joy. Does that make sense in terms of the way you're describing this?
Thank you, Meredith. Yeah, in the image or the idea of the garden is the more you get rid of the weeds, the more that naturally the flowers will occur. That the idea of being open to the afflictions and being able to handle them will naturally let joy come through. You don't have to seek for it, although there are ways to kind of seek for it. But yeah, and of course, the more joy and positivity you have, the more you're also able to deal with those arrows. It's almost like the joy is a bit of a body armor. So the arrow, it's there, it gets there, but it doesn't seem to have as much of a sting. So thanks. Does anybody else have a hand up? I've got to go back to the other screen here. Time maybe for one more question, if anyone has anything. Well, thank you all for your kind attention today. We're going to be talking about the next 2 days. We're going to be talking about happiness and a path from real. I would like to think practical ways that we can live our lives instead of a lot of this theoretical stuff about first arrows and second arrows and all that other stuff. Not that it's not important and useful. So we're going to take a 10-minute break. We'll come back at 11:10, and at that time, people who wish to stay to do Dharma discussion group, we will assign you into groups, and those of you who do not stay will certainly end up seeing you somewhere down the line. I hope your path is smooth and wonderful. Thank you all for your kind attention this morning.
Thanks, Paul.